Hello, everyone. My name is Wayne Callan, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD experts presentation, titled The Power of Family Engagement: How Involved Parents Can Foster a Child's Self-Advocacy Skills. Decades of research tell us that a parent's close bond and engagement with their child leads to academic success. For children with learning differences, this engagement is also paramount to their social and emotional well-being, in large part because it unlocks self-advocacy skills. In this webinar, we will learn about the impact of empowering student advocacy and harnessing parent engagement on social emotional development, academic achievement, and overall mental health for students with learning differences. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Michael Nakkula. Dr. Nakkula is a professor of practice and chair of the Division of Human Development and Quantitative Methods at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. He teaches courses on adolescent development and the intersection of counseling, mentoring, and education within urban public schools. Among his publications, Professor Nakkula is the lead author of Understanding Youth: Adolescent Development for Educators and Building Healthy Communities for Positive Youth Development. Professor Nakkula's 3-volume edited collection on possibility development for young people around the world addresses the ways in which youth perspectives on their future are both supported by and at times undermined by the opportunity structures that surround them. Before I hand over the microphone to Dr. Nakkula, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you are interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you receive around an hour after the live broadcast. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search Podcast 381 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the Certificate of Attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine for your family or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Finally, the sponsor of this week's webinar is Play Attention: Enhance Brain Health and Performance. For over 25 years, Play Attention has been helping children and adults thrive and succeed at school, home, and work. Their NASA-inspired technology and cognitive exercises improve executive function and self-regulation. Each program includes a lifetime membership and a personal executive function coach to customize your plan along the way. Click on the hyperlink on your screen for a free one-on-one consultation to discuss a customized executive function training plan for you, or you can call 1-800-788-6786 or visit their website, www.playattention.com. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Nakkula. Thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, to lead the discussion.
Wayne, thank you. It's a delight to be here. You know, with a topic like parent engagement with their students, it's an area I could talk about all day. So I promise to keep things under control and within our time constraints, so we have a chance to interact with each other toward the end. But before I begin, I want to thank my colleague Eric Tishalis, who really began much of the work with me that I'm going to talk about today. Eric was a longtime educator and a real advocate of children, adolescents, and parents. So Eric, if you're out there anywhere, thanks for the help in putting this together. And my later colleagues on parent engagement, Sylvia and Jared, I want to thank you as well. Without the three of you, we wouldn't be here today in the place we're in. So I think the moral of that story is nothing happens alone. It's all about partnership, and that's very much what this talk is going to be about. So just to touch on the basic points on this slide for the folks who are listening, the key points that we'll talk about today include student agency and voice. They're not quite the same thing, but they're highly related, and we're going to unpack that a little bit. The vital role of parent engagement in education, that is not as straightforward a topic as it might seem. Many educators know that some parents engage in ways that are not always so healthy, and I will say, including me with my own children at times. So engagement is one thing, constructive engagement is another, and we'll get into that a little bit as well. And the magic combination of student voice and family engagement, what is it about this connection that leads to the outcomes we find in our research? And again, as I mentioned a moment ago, I think it comes down to partnership. When parents partner with their children in education and in other areas, things tend to go much better than if one side is telling the other what to do and moving along kind of at odds with one another. So there's research and resources that support agency and engagement. You'll see some of those in the slides. I just want to say this piece for context. There's more information in the slides than I'll talk about in the brief time we have together. And part of the reason that information is there, so you as participants, whether you are parents or educators or you play some other role with children, there are plenty of resources here to look at on your own time. So we hope the benefits of this presentation go far beyond the talk today and really open up opportunities for you to get involved more deeply even in this groundbreaking work. And then at the end, there's an invitation to join my colleagues and I in what I really consider a breakthrough in parent, student, and school engagement. It's a new app called Gabon, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. It's something I've been looking for a long time. A clear avenue, a direct link, if you will, between students in school and their parents at home. Teachers I talk to, school leaders I talk to, are very high on this aspect of parent-student school engagement, which I'll talk about a little bit as we go along. So much of the work that I'm talking about today comes from this document that I put together with my colleague Eric Deschalis a number of years ago on motivation, engagement, and student voice. And this came out of an effort to promote higher levels of student-centered learning. There are advocates around the country, including the folks from an organization called Jobs for the Future in Boston. Jobs for the Future was collaborating with the Nellie Mae Education Foundation around student-centered learning. And as I got more deeply into that topic with my colleague Eric, for us it came down to these three pieces: motivation, engagement, and voice. They all go together. If we have motivated students, those students are almost guaranteed to do well enough in school. There's still a range of performance, but motivation is key. And we believe engagement in a variety of ways leads to that motivation. And when student voice is at the center of the process, engagement goes up and motivation goes up as well. So you might think of this as the trifecta, if you will: motivation, engagement, and voice. So student agency and student voice, what does this really mean? So I'm not going to read what you see on the slide, but agency is really that capacity we have to be agents in our own lives. We often hear about this as being proactive. Are students proactive in going after their educational goals? Are young adults proactive in going after their life goals? So agency breaks down really into being an agent of change in our own lives, and ultimately then in our school environments and in the communities around us. So active agency is part of motivation. If you're not motivated, you're not going to be an agent in your life or in the lives of others in constructive ways. So how does that link to student voice? Well, agency doesn't happen in a vacuum. We don't become agents just because someone hands it to us or helps us get there. We actually construct agency through our actions, and a key action is having a voice in what we do. So, one of the critiques of education in many contexts, including my own classrooms at Penn, is sometimes the too talkative professors talk too much and don't leave enough room for students to construct meaning in the classroom through their own voice. So when we create opportunities for student voice to be expanded and really exercised, like any form of exercise, agency is one of the core outcomes. And as you'll see from the talk today, agency leads to a number of other extremely valued outcomes. So voice and agency are part of a process with voice really being playing a core role in the building of agency, because it's how we construct our connections with other people, and even then learn to have an inner voice that tells us to act on our own behalf and on behalf of the people around us. One second. So I touched on this. Let me go to the previous slide. Why is agency so important? I mean, I touched on this in the prior slide, so this is a little bit of a replication, but I'm going to underscore just a couple more in a couple more ways. You see the research that's cited here. And the first one, this is kind of a breakthrough study by Mitra and ultimately Mitra and colleagues. When students believe that they are valued for their perspectives and respected, they begin to develop a sense of ownership and attachment to the organization in which they are involved. But students can't be valued if they're not heard. If they can't express themselves and have their opinions respected, they lose out on that opportunity. So one of the reasons that voice as part of agency is so critical is because without it, there's just not that opportunity to grow. And we see from the other lines of research connected in the slide, being able to talk about one's own experiences of learning in school really is an important aspect of student voice and agency. You're going to hear a little bit later in the talk why such questions from parents like me often fall flat. How did school go today? When you ask an exhausted child that at 3 in the afternoon or 4 in the afternoon, or whenever you might ask that question, maybe when you come home from work at 6 in the afternoon, school is a long time ago. And the students are likely, like my children, to say, it was good, or not too much, nothing new. It's very hard to get into the specifics of reviewing a school day when the question is asked in the abstract and detached from what actually happened by hours, and sometimes even by days when we haven't really had a chance to connect with our children in a while. So the final point on this slide, I think, is a really interesting one. To be captured by one's work. I think captured is an interesting word to me. I want to come back to that in a moment. To be captured by it really means, in my mind, to be captivated by it, to allow one's work, one's schoolwork, or one's work as an adult in the workforce, to really be an environment we want to be embedded in, not run away from. So when our students, when our children really have an opportunity to be captivated by their work in school, because it becomes interesting, they're obviously going to be stronger students. Parents can play a role in that process in an extraordinary sense, as we've learned over time. But that role can cut both ways. Parents can actually get in the way of students' engagement in school if the communication processes are too unilateral, and parents are asking about school, not liking the answers they get, and correcting their children's responses to kind of fit their own model of how their children should be engaging in school. We call that one-way unilateral communication from parents, where parents are trying to be the correctors or advisors of their children. And we all play that role to a certain degree as parents. We have to play that role, but we can play it in more skilled ways that don't turn our students off or our children off from talking with us. So we're going to look a little bit at how the process of being captivated or captured plays out in some of the things that we can do. But as our students move from elementary school toward middle school and then high school, more complex factors come into play. And that is, as we have on this slide, the search for meaning and identity, for example. By middle school, as we know, our children are really seeking a sense of identity. Who am I in this place? Who am I in the school place? Who am I in the family place or space? Who am I with my peers? All of these are identity questions. And if identity gets formulated strictly around peer involvement and and not meaningfully around school involvement and family involvement, we end up seeing some of the problems that are all too pervasive in our society. And we'll come back to this point in a moment as well. Just the notion of this slide is that this isn't a proposition for some students or some children or some people. This is a proposition for everybody. Not all of us experience the same sense of agency in our lives, and we experience agency in different domains. So it's incumbent upon us as parents and educators, for example, to be sure that children aren't left out of the process. And the way we see this play out in school so frequently is that some students will take up most of the agentic work in the classroom, if you will. We have the active talkers, the active engagers, and my colleague, Karen Foster, with whom I worked for many years on issues like this one, used to call it the star kid phenomenon. Every teacher likes having star kids in the classroom who ignite conversation, but that can also lead to other students being silenced to a certain degree or feeling incompetent and incapable of keeping up or making contributions that are valued. And when that happens, their sense of agency deteriorates, at least in the school space. Maybe they pick it up somewhere else. So teachers know this, but it's important to really reach all of our students to the best of our ability. And it's important for us as parents to reach all of our children to the best of our ability. Everybody deserves to have their voice heard, even though we don't all want it heard in the same way. And everybody needs a sense of agency in order to function in the world, especially when things become more complex and conflicted. And we certainly don't have to provide examples of that. We see so much of it in our society today. The need for more authentic connection across differences and building that sense of agency among all of our students gives us a chance for more comprehensive dialogue across all the stakeholders in our schools and in our society. So I want to clarify this notion up at the top, where we say agency is the executive functions of the prefrontal cortex. That is a mouthful of words and concepts, and it's all so important. But so what is executive functioning actually? This is a word commonly used in the fields of psychology and education and really important in neuroscience. But executive functioning is really the development of those skills we all need to manage our lives. What do executives do? Executives run the show, right? We need powerful executives to get our businesses on the right track. We need executives to get our school systems on the right track. We as individuals need an executive to keep us on the right track. And that executive comes from the prefrontal cortex in our brain. That's where the activities and thinking and planning all come together to give us the skills to run our own lives and to connect our lives with the lives of other people. So, if we think about a corporate executive model, the corporation doesn't work on its own. It's a conglomeration of a lot of people, a lot of interactions with other groups and stakeholders. And every individual life is that way as well. Again, we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a complex, integrated society. So for us to be able to play our roles there, our executive functioning needs to be developed as fully as possible. Not just from a selfish perspective to get what we need, but really to help pull all of us together to get what we as a community need on a larger level. As we play this slide out a little bit, we talk about agency flourishing when students have the structures, supports, and freedoms to explore and invent things. Well, where do those structures come from? We have the individual brain, but what is so fascinating about brain research over the past 2 decades, even beyond that, but the last 2 decades especially, have shown us that the mind and the brain are so integrally connected. That is, what we think about and do actually changes the structures of our brain. We used to think brains drove the mind more completely. Now we know that the mind develops the brain. with mind defined as the way, what we think about, what we focus on, how we reflect, what we do, how we think about what we do, etc. All of those activities actually rewire our brains, which in turn then give us more capacity to use our minds and to exercise our agency in the ways that we want to. The next couple of points on here are really important for school environments. Opportunities within IEP development. So IEP is individual education plans. And we usually see IEPs, or almost always see IEPs, connected with students who need accommodations of some sorts in their learning. Often students who are in special education environments or classes, but also students who are in mainstream classes but have some learning needs that require accommodations. There are educators who believe every student should have some form of an IEP, an individual education plan. And in fact, informally, we could argue that every student does. Students go about their educations in the way that they can and to a certain degree want to within their particular education structures. But the point here is that when students develop a sense of agency so that they can advocate for themselves, they play more of a role in the development of their IEPs. And I would say more of an active role in carrying out their IEPs. We know from lots of experience that you can have good plans that don't result in positive actions or constructive actions. So planning comes down to acting if it's going to be a useful plan. And executive functioning is critical for that. So what are the outcomes connected with some of this work? Increased student engagement, that's kind of obvious, right? A sense of agency requires a type of engagement, but in this case, we're talking about engagement in school. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment and look at it in relation to other forms of engagement. Elevated achievement levels, that simply follows increases in engagement. Where you have more engagement on average, you get higher achievement. Greater classroom participation, engagement again is defined in part by classroom participation. But when a student feels a sense of agency, they're more likely to jump in and participate. This next one's really critical as well. Better self-reflection and preparation for improvement. Interestingly, students tend not to self-reflect, at least not self-reflect actively, if they're not engaged. Let me just pause for a moment to take a drink of water. I'm talking a little too fast. I'm not accustomed to the individual monologue without more interaction along the way, so excuse me for that. But self-reflection is another exercise of voice. It is a way of looking at ourselves and carrying out an internal discussion about how things are going. And in some of the work that I do, we talk about two arcs in a learning process. A forward arc of projection, where you throw yourself into your work, you throw yourself into your activities. So when we talk about agency, it's taking an agentic stance to really get involved in things. The return arc of reflection asks us to question what it all means. So I did this, what's the benefit of it? What came out of my actions or activities that are going to be helpful to me and helpful to others? So you might think about those two arcs, the arc of projection, being projected into action, and the arc of reflection. And from an educational perspective, it's that reflective arc that leads to higher level learning, really critiquing what it is that we're doing so that we can do it better in the future. The final point here, which is so important in everything we see in society with young people and older people alike, decreases in anxiety and behavior problems. In my work as a psychologist, I'm called upon to address issues of anxiety, stress, and depression. They tend to go hand in hand. And they often come from high stress conditions in school. And they're often conditions where students are struggling alone without the support from parents or other personnel that can help them work through some of the challenges that they're engaged in. So with more of a sense of agency and connectedness to others, anxiety tends to be reduced. It tends to be increased through isolation and reduced through connectedness. The second part of this is interesting as well, behavior problems. I've talked to some people who think or believe that an increased sense of agency for some students might lead to increased behavior problems. And I can understand why one might think that. But here's the logic behind why we see otherwise through our research. When students are connected to learning, when they feel like they have an agentic role in the learning process, they're bought in, if you will. They're in the learning process. When they're not connected, they tend to act out. If they don't feel welcomed in a certain context, like school or a friendship group, they'll act out in opposition to that. This is where we hear language like oppositional defiant behavior or disorders. Oppositionality tends to be a response to not feeling welcomed, whether one is welcomed or not. It's a felt sense of not being welcomed, and that often leads to acting out. So if we can engage with students so they feel in it, involved in our work, and central to it, they're less likely to feel a need to act out through opposition.
Michael, can I possibly jump in, because several people have shown some interest in, as a child is developing agency, a lot of times, especially among students with ADHD, their conclusion about themselves, even at an early age, is that because their grades aren't up to snuff or whatever that is, they feel like losers, and their morale is very low. Can that undercut their agency, even with parents working hard to help develop it?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the things we know very clearly, Wayne, is that there's no panacea. All of these things go together and they're part of a working process. But for students who are feeling disenfranchised, falling behind in school, and demoralized, that is absolutely going to make it harder for parents to engage with them in certain ways, which is why that engagement is all the more important. So let me make sure I have this right, Wayne, so I can give a bit of an explanation to that.
Sure.
Before we move on.
Yeah.
We often feel that if we do the right thing as parents or as educators, we can have an immediate and direct impact on our children and our students. But the fact of the matter is that the impact is usually nonlinear and occurs over time. So we have to be willing to sometimes accept the process for what it is, even when we don't see the outcome yet. The likelihood is that outcome will come over time. The thing we do know is that whatever status the child is in, a state of feeling demoralized or disconnected, whatever that may be, engagement with constructive support is the most effective thing we can do. Engagement with constructive support. But it doesn't mean that that engagement with constructive support is going to show overnight results. It often will take time. Not sure if that's getting at the question precisely, but that's how I'm hearing it.
No, that's perfect. That addresses it. And while we're just on this, one more, and we will get to questions, but what about children in cultures where student agency is not encouraged? How do we navigate this cultural difference? I don't know if you've run up against that, or
we do. Yeah, we do run up against. Yeah, we do run up against it. Some people talk about it in terms of collectivist societies versus individualistic societies, and might see agency as an individualistic action. But when we unpack that a little bit with students from those backgrounds, there's still a need to be agentic in one's own way. You know, how do you play a role? How do you play a role within the expected context you're living in? Whether that's a context where a child is being reared to be a listener more than a speaker, to follow their parents' role modeling or expectations, and the school's role modeling and expectations, one still needs a sense of agency to do that authentically. Otherwise, you're just following. So even in cultures or families where parents want their children to behave and follow the rules, there is still typically a desire to have that done authentically. They don't necessarily want their children to be followers as they're growing up, but role players, kind of within a collectivist endeavor.
Right. Yep. Okay. Well, I didn't want to interrupt too much, but I just wanted to get those questions answered now. So
that was helpful, and it gave me a chance to catch my voice a little bit as well.
Yeah, okay, good.
Right. So I moved around on the slides a little bit to make sure that I was in the right place. So let's pick up for the sake of time, let's pick up right here. We have about 10 minutes or so left before we open it up to 10 to 15 minutes before we open it up to further questions. But the impact of agency on voice comes in many forms. And again, I think those questions that were just raised are really critical ones, because it underscores the fact that this is a process, a longitudinal process, if you will, not a short-term endeavor, though we do see short-term breakthroughs as well. But we talk about competencies. Let me just go up to the previous slide for one moment, and I'll come right back to this one. We hit on that one pretty well. Competencies and skills, what are educators trying to accomplish in school? They don't just want their students to learn facts for the most part. They want them to become skilled learners and skilled actors in the world. But agency can lead to competencies in, all of the following areas: physical, intellectual, psychological, and social, emotional. Because what is agency and voice? It's a form of leadership, leadership in one's own way. So to be proactively involved in the physical arena or in sports, for example, comes with many benefits. Hard to do that without some sense of agency. And I want to add this just to complicate it a little bit, because Wayne, those questions made me think about the kind of interdependency of some forms of agency. It's not solely an individual act. It's very much an interdependent act. So the capacity to connect with peers who might be athletes can get one involved in the physical domain or other types of physical activities. The same thing with the intellectual arena. I've seen tremendous intellectual gains from students who were interactively connected with peers, even when teachers and parents couldn't move them as effectively. I'm just going to touch on the social and cultural capital piece. What does that actually mean with respect to new skills? Students develop social capital, so to speak, by building social networks with peers, students, fellow musicians, athletes, whomever they're connected with. So to be in isolation, to be working in isolation, is the antithesis of developing social capital in many ways. It's really an issue of connectivity across different sets of people. Cultural capital is really interesting from this perspective as well. It is the sense of being connected to a meaningful culture that one can draw strength from. That could be a racial culture, a family culture, or a school culture. So again, these things come down to interdependence, interconnectedness, as opposed to kind of just individual strengths. I'm not going to go over this slide too much. It's here more as a reference and a summary slide for the parents and educators who are listening to the presentation and engaging with us today. But essentially, what it does, building on the last set of comments, it outlines the competencies that are associated with engagement and voice, and how those competencies lead to particular outcomes. So in the cognitive arena, it's about thinking and critical thinking skills. In the social arena, it's about connections with peers. In the emotional arena, it's the sense you have of yourself and how emotionally connected you are to not only yourself as a person, but to the world at large, including your peer groups. So I know there's a lot of busyness on here, but it really it gets at this point that agency really is an interpersonal process as much as an individual one. It's all about connecting, which we're going to wrap up with in a moment. The next slide is also here. This is one of my favorite syntheses of the research on this topic. And again, I give Eric Tishalis a lot of credit for pulling this together. But it addresses student voice along a continuum and really shows how it's not one thing. So on the left-hand side, the minimal degree of voice or manifestation of voice is like raising your hand in school and expressing an opinion. And certainly that is important when, especially for students who might not be so inclined to do that. if you move all the way along the continuum to the right side, you get into leadership. And basically what this graphic shows us is how one can move from making minimal contributions to being a more connected and participatory actor, all the way toward the end of the continuum where you're taking a leadership in areas that matter. I'm a real proponent in honing in on the middle of this, where we see participation and partnership. In my mind, that's what it's all about. How we build partnerships with others in the world in order to make a contribution. And, parent-child engagement is at its core a partnership. When it's a unilateral process in the way I was talking about earlier, where it's one-way communication with parents either telling children what to do or unilaterally children not listening, either just following what their parents want them to do or not listening, that's not really a partnership. It's kind of a form of disengagement that really makes it hard to get to the more complex tasks that we'll all need to do as we move into more demanding environments. So again, this is here for future reference more than for us to unpack today, given the amount of time we have available. I've been talking a lot about parent engagement in various ways as we've gone through the presentation, but I just want to not take for granted a common understanding for what it is. So I've been using the language of unilateralism a little bit. There are parents who are very actively involved with their children's lives in authoritative roles or disciplinary roles. And certainly we have to do that. And it is a type of parent engagement, but it tends not to be the most constructive one over time. The type of parent engagement that we find most helpful for managing children's behavior, for helping them move forward in the world, is interactive engagement. So the opposite of unilateral engagement is reciprocal engagement, where there's a back and forth, where a parent isn't just a teller of what to do, but also a listener of how our children are doing. And believe me, I have played multiple sides of this arrangement in my role with my two children. I have children who are now 21 and 19 years old. And as I became a better listener over time, I became a better partner with my children. And as I became a better partner with my children, I was able to have more of an impact on them and what they do. And they were actually able to have more of an impact on me and what I can do better as a parent to support them. So we in the social psychology arena, we call this reciprocity. And they're even more, at the more advanced level of reciprocity is collaboration, really thinking about parent-child relationships as a collaborative endeavor. How are we going to do this together so our children get the best outcomes in life and parents get the gratification we so desire by having positive relationships with our children and seeing our children do well in school and elsewhere? So reciprocity is very much at the key of this. Educators will often talk with concern about some parents being too active in school. And that usually comes down to parents who are highly anxious about their children's performance, like I have been at times, and really engage in processes that can interfere even with the teacher-student relationships. So engagement isn't a simple act. When done well, it really it's more of an art than a science. It's the art of connecting so that people want to be involved with us, in this case, our children, and so that we can have a reciprocal impact on one another. The rest of this is fairly straightforward, and we can think about that a little further through the questions and answers. So we talked about this a little bit already, why it's so important, and I think for me, this comes down to partnership again. And I touched on the teacher role in this in my last comment, but parents, teachers, and students are in this together, but we're not always in it in the same way. We have multiple agendas. Our kids have multiple teachers over time, and even multiple teachers in 1 year. So those communication processes are complex, and sometimes too complex to work through with all the nuance that we'd like. So what do we do about that? How do we help make the connections across parents, teachers, and students more effectively, kind of in support of our students being more engaged learners? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but reciprocal parent engagement strengthens family connections, improves parent-child communication, provides a family window into their child's day from home, the child's school day, that is, and has the impact of reducing anxiety, including the all-important factor of parent anxiety. I will share that as we had a family challenge in our family yesterday, which left me at home with my 21-year-old child. And as I was sleeping and I knew he was in the house or out of the house, any disturbance in my sleep had to do with my anxiety about him. Perhaps a little neurotic anxiety, perhaps realistic anxiety. But on some level, parents tend to be anxious about their children to various degrees. So the ways we manage our own anxiety has a huge impact on the way our children manage theirs. So student voice and parent engagement, that might be the coupling that is at the center of this that's just so critical. I want to make sure we have time to end with the intervention I was alluding to earlier in the presentation and talk about that a little bit. But you see all of these school-based connections, home-based connections. We talked a little earlier about the impact on special education. So engagement is at the core of all this. Engagement's at the core of learning. It's at the core of counseling and psychotherapy. It's at the core of virtually all the constructive activities we engage in. This slide is in here because, you know, one of the things that we sometimes get exhausted about is the need to consistently engage. Like, haven't we done enough already? I thought we made a breakthrough. Why have things gone south again when they seem to be going in the right direction for a good bit of time? So this goes back to the question that Wayne asked earlier, coming from somebody in the audience. You know, what happens when certain students don't feel like they can engage well, and efforts by parents to engage really don't seem to make a difference? I will say this, even when we don't see the difference externally through behavior, every act of engagement over time has an impact. We might not see it all fully on the surface, but internally, each engagement opens up the possibility of the next engagement. So there's a little bit of faith involved here until we see the products of this work. But again, it is a long-term investment. I'm not going to spend more time on this one. We've talked about it already, the impact on learning. I wanted to say a little bit about possibility development, which is the way I frame pretty much all of my work right now. I think of learning as really being an act of possibility development. And what is possibility development? The way we define it in our current research here at Penn and through our partnerships around the world, possibility development is the processes we all go through in figuring out what we want to do and be, and then acting on that calculation. So learning to have agency on our plans. That combination leads to us actualizing possibilities, not just imagining them. So it's that process of going from imagining what we might do to acting on what we might do and actually doing it. So it's we've written a lot about this, and we really see it as the core of education, and some of my colleagues see it as the core of workforce development as well. What possibilities can we create through our work, and what do we need to do in order to actualize those possibilities? So this leads me to what I want to talk about in our latest research with some new technology that I myself could not have comprehended or developed. So this comes back to partnership again, but with Sylvia and Jared Hall, I've had an opportunity to actually begin studying with my colleagues the possibility of seeing what happens when a student reaches out to the parent from school with just one word. It's almost one word or phrase that the parent can then hold on to and ask about when the child comes home. So earlier in the presentation, I mentioned this notion of it being so difficult to get children to respond to parents in the abstract when we just ask, how was your school day? Well, Gabon is a direct answer to that. It asks the student to lead the conversation the after-school conversation by saying something about what happened in the school day that the parents can then ask about later in the day. And we have so far seen this turn into extraordinary conversations that I believe would not have happened without the capacity to communicate in this way. We're looking for more partners in this work because it's just taking off. So if you're interested in being involved, anyone on this call, or you think someone else might be interested, you can reach out to Sylvia at Gabon, as you see on the slide here, and you'll have access to these slides. I just want to end by giving you a couple of examples of what we've seen already with the use of this technology. A student sends the word robot home, and the parent thinks, well, what is that discussion going to be about? Was there a welding project in school? And the student goes on to say much more, that it's about bringing consciousness to AI and how robots of all sorts engage with the world. So in this case, the parent might have thought the student, their child, had not been thinking of artificial intelligence at all, or the role of robots in our future that many of us older people are thinking about. So it leads to more in-depth conversations. I'm not going to go through all these with you because we just don't have time now, but the car didn't blow up. And of course, the all-pervasive comment, nothing, which I love, with nothing as a conversation starter. And he goes, I love biology, but grades have dropped. So he says nothing is the thing he leads, and the parent then inquires about nothing. And the conversation moves from there. So in a nutshell, the impact of having an opportunity to look at student-initiated parent engagement about school has the potential for building family connectedness, a sense of confidence, all the things you see on here, because child-parent communication has been found to be perhaps the most important factor in overall brain development and social and emotional development for children. Again, it's not the panacea, but we know we can't do without it. So with that said, I'm out of my time for talking at you, and now we'll save a little bit more time to talk with you. But thanks for being here. Thanks for engaging in this conversation, and I look forward to hearing what's on your mind.
Thanks for the great presentation, Michael. It was excellent. Here's one we get a lot, I know, at ADDitude magazine. It's a tough one. How do you motivate a 12-year-old boy to be his own agent when he doesn't care about school or really anything?
Yeah, well, I've been there, and that's the way we see that in school all the time. That might be one of the biggest challenges we take on in school counseling work with middle school students, the 12-year-old boy who says they don't care about anything. So first and foremost, communication is a defense mechanism. When a person says, I don't care about anything, they're saying much more than I don't care about anything. They might be saying, I'm not capable, I'm not confident. But I would see that very communication as an outreach of sorts, and I would take it very seriously. The espoused lack of caring, I would, as a therapist, I would turn that around and say that the person is asking for reasons to believe that they themselves are worth caring about, that they have something of value. So I think when parents communicate with their children around this, one of the unilateral things we typically do is tell them, no, you are worthwhile. We love you. You're a great person. And those messages are important to communicate about. But I think what I look for in this work, and what I think, technologies like Gabon have an opportunity to help us with, might be considered kernels of care. Not the big picture. We often talk about the need to develop purpose in life. Critically important, but purpose starts with a kernel. It's not always this big grand exploration or engagement in meaning. Can we find these little kernels of care that we can focus on and cultivate with our children so they grow into something else? I just want to tell you just one quick caveat on that as well, Wayne. We did a study of a school in New York that was showing impressive results in teacher-student connectedness. And as we listened to students talk about what they got out of that school, many of the students said just what you asked about. They said, when I came to this school in the 9th grade, I didn't care. And they talked about all of these things, and I didn't believe it because I'd never seen it. But when you experience being cared about over time, you start seeing that it's real. And once you see that it's real, you start caring about learning. The students didn't say it quite in that summed up a way, but that's a summary of what many of the students told us. We don't feel cared about in school, and therefore we don't care about learning. It goes back to the notion of care being a two-way street, in us doing all we can to tap into the parts of our children and our students that we find meaningful and we hope they can find meaningful.
Mm-hmm. At what age can parents, teachers, et cetera, start helping a child develop agency/voice or voice/agency? And as a corollary to that, do you feel that they should be students at a young age, be part of their building their IEP?
Those are great questions. For the first one, at what point do we help children start beginning to develop a sense of agency? That starts in infancy. It's and in fact, sometimes infants and toddlers are more agentic than kindergartners and first graders, that the sense of agency gets socialized out of some children by forcing them into contexts where they have to fit in and not be agentic, to continue to listen, to follow the rules, both things of which are important. But how can we help our students fit in and follow the rules while also building a sense of self and being an active engager in those contexts while following rules? So toddlerhood is all about developing agency, as it's often talked about, learning to stand on your own 2 feet, and then take action in the world. So that's the beginning of the process of agency. In kindergarten, preschool is so important for a variety of reasons, but not primarily for early learning of the alphabet or literacy or things to that effect, but really for being a connected engager with peers and teachers. If students can learn to be connectors, can feel like they have some role in their relationships, they are on average going to be more receptive to learning. The IEP question, I hear on multiple levels. Every student should be involved in an IEP at the level of discussing how they can take action on their plan, how they feel about their plan. There are aspects of IEPs that are too complex, technically to share with a third grader or, in technical terms. But how can we translate the language of an IEP into a vocabulary children can connect with so that they can participate in it? Because they must be involved in the IEP for the IEP to work. It can't simply be imposed on them. Mm-hmm. They have to buy in as participants on some level. So I think there are varying degrees of involvement, but perhaps the most important one is talking with students about the accommodations, why they're being made, and how they might be helpful, and getting the student feedback on that.
Mm-hmm. A couple of parents have asked, how do you know when the support they're providing to, enhance agency is not being constructive, especially for a young adult? So you've sort of outlined what it is we should all be striving for, but how do you know when it's not helping?
Well, such complex questions, because what could look like not helping might actually be helpful, right? We often see people who are opposed, they're oppositional to support. So any supports offered are met with disdain or reactivity. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those supports aren't helpful. It might mean, in fact, the disdain and reactivity could itself be a form of agency. I'm not going to just let you tell me what to do or what's right for me. I have a sense of what's right for me. And, I went through something precisely like this with my young adult child. I had to recognize that I was saying too much. It was falling on deaf ears. He was feeling lectured to, and it was counterproductive. As I had to let go, and that came with more anxiety for me. I had to let go a bit and bring him in more. And once he felt that I wasn't going to counter every interpretation he had, but relatively hear him and ask him questions as opposed to telling him things, we got on better footing. I'm not saying that's a panacea. Life is challenging all along the way, and he still has a way to go.
Mm-hmm.
But I recognized that that my efforts were failing because he was feeling like they were too unilateral. So, we have to read the audience. In this case, the most important audience member is our own child. And there are no absolute right and wrong answers to this stuff, but we have to be as attuned as we can as listeners and as engagers.
Right. And a couple of parents are going to hold you to your promise that, unless I missed it somehow, being captured by work versus being captivated by work. Do you want to expand on that a little?
Yeah, I didn't really mean it as a versus. I meant it as in relation to each other. Being captivated means really being connected to it and engaged by it. And captured, then it becomes a holding environment for us. We want to be integrated into work contexts that are meaningful. And when that happens, we're captured in the best of ways, not captives, but really captivated participants. So they go together. I didn't really mean it in a versus term.
Oh, okay. Okay. And are there any tried and true methods in terms of enhancing that, either by a teacher or a parent?
The tried and true method really, I believe, is interactivity.
Okay.
I hear this among faculty members at Penn. If faculty members at Penn feel like they're told what to do, they become less engaged. We have to feel like we have a stake in the work and that our contributions are meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that's hour is about up. We might have a minute, but I'm not sure I'll give you enough time to answer the question. So why don't we just end it here? I thought it was excellent. You educated me, and I'm sure others on this topic. Wonderful insights. So thank you.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you, everyone, for attending. It was really a pleasure to be here with you and have a chance to, initiate a conversation today.
Great. So next week, our free webinar will be on revenge, bedtime procrastination with Dr. Christine Lee and Tracy Atsuka. We hope you can join us. Make sure you don't miss future ADDitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at additudemag.com/newsletters. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.